Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virch, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. And if you love the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. Today, we have Nicholas Wade on again. He was just on a few weeks ago. But Nicholas is a journalist who's written for publications such as the New York Times, Nature, Science, and others. He's the author of a recent article about the lab leak hypothesis for the coronavirus that was published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And Nicholas, thank you for coming back on such short notice.
My pleasure.
We have a bit of breaking news, and this is not a breaking news kind of podcast. Sometimes we talk about space exploration and filmmaking and other things, but this story is one of the most important ones of the century, probably, and it's not being very well reported. But before we talk about what is going on with the lab leak hypothesis, can you give us a brief kind of refresher overview of what we talked about the last time? What is the case that coronavirus came from a lab and not from nature?
I'm sure. Well, there are two hypotheses on the table. One, as you said, is that it could have come from nature. Epidemics do that all the time. It's a very plausible hypothesis. But the other is that it escaped from a lab. And this too is plausible for several reasons that I'll now try and briefly explain. One is that we know that the coronaviruses were being manipulated at the Institute of Virology in Wuhan in China. And scientists were manipulating them there in order to try and predict and forestall the next epidemic. But that means sort of creating viruses that might be the cause of such an epidemic. So it's perfectly possible that such a virus escaped, because viruses do escape from labs all the time. It happens quite regularly going back into the distant past. Now, in this context, it's rather important that the virus, the pandemic, did first of all break out in Wuhan, right where the Wuhan Institute of Virology is. So there you have very good circumstantial evidence for at least raising the question of whether the virus couldn't have escaped from that lab. There's other features that are relevant. It has a very curious part of its anatomy that no other virus in its family has, but could very easily have been inserted in a lab. We have the fact that right from the outset, it was very infectious to humans, whereas these viruses usually take quite a lot of tries and mutations before they become well adapted to their human subjects. So these all establish lab escape as a very plausible hypothesis that should certainly be considered alongside natural emergence.
And on top of all that, you really can't prove that it wasn't a lab leak because the lab was locked down. We haven't had access to it, and on and on and on. And on top of all of that, this lab had some interesting funding sources.
Right. The research, some of the research at this lab was being funded by the National Institutes of Health in Washington via one of its component institutes called the NIAID. That's the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, headed by Dr. Anthony Fauci. So the NIH as a whole is headed by Dr. Francis Collins. So Dr. Fauci at NIAID was sending money to a nonprofit organization in New York called the EcoHealth Alliance. And the EcoHealth Alliance, in turn, was sending money to Dr. Shizheng Li at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So the NIH, in brief, was funding research at the Wuhan Institute. We know in some detail what that research consisted of. We know it was being conducted in very low safety conditions, but it involved pretty dangerous manipulations of the virus.
And who runs the EcoHealth organization?
So that's headed by Dr. Peter Daszak, who's sort of made a career of attracting funds from various US government agencies, including NIAID, which he uses to fund virology research and exploration in many parts of the world.
And he is not a fan of the lab leak hypothesis. Can you explain a little bit his role in that and the WHO investigation?
Sure. Well, when the lab leak hypothesis first became a possibility, Dr. Daszak spearheaded the attempt to portray it as a ludicrous conspiracy theory. He wrote a letter in the Lancet signed by many other scientists who he organized and co-opted for the purpose, which condemned lab leak as a conspiracy theory. He neglected to mention that he had a glaring conflict of interest in this regard, that he himself had funded the research that might well have been the source of the lab leak. And his letter in the Lancet ended with the words, "We declare no conflict of interest," which was
precisely
a
right.
blatant untruth.
Right. And then fast forward a year, there's a big international investigation and the WHO goes to Wuhan. Sounds like a bad B movie.
Right. And who was on the WHO delegation?
Well, we wanted several scientists and the Chinese denied that, right?
The Chinese have managed to acquire enormous influence over the WHO. They more or less handpicked the delegates, one of whom was none other than Peter Daszak.
Mm-hmm.
And
his conclusion was? Yeah.
Well, his conclusion was that lab leak was a ridiculous hypothesis that wasn't worth considering further, and that obviously the virus had emerged naturally, and that more work must be done along these lines. But this conclusion backfired considerably, it seems to me, on the Chinese authorities who had worked so hard to manipulate the WHO, because it was clear to people that if the virus had emerged naturally, there should be lots of evidence about its emergence, both in the human populations from serology. There should be the intermediate animal from which the virus jumped from bats to humans, which should be identified in the 2 previous cases we've had of coronavirus epidemics. That animal species should have been identified. Yet the Chinese were unable to provide a single shred of evidence in support of the natural emergence hypothesis. So this is, I think, when the tide began to turn and people started to think, well, if there's no evidence for natural emergence, which had been expected all along, then maybe we should start to consider other explanations.
So as I mentioned before, I have jury duty coming up, and in the US court system, you can get a conviction on circumstantial evidence. And, you know, if this were a case in a court of law, there is an awful lot of circumstantial evidence in favor of lab leak, to say the least. And this kind of has lingered, and not lingered, it's languished for the last 6 months. So there's some overwhelming evidence that this has happened, and it's changed the world. It's literally changed the course of history. It's cost us trillions of dollars. Millions of people have died. And nobody's really talking about it, which baffles me. And then yesterday, I saw an article that came out, and this is what I really want to focus on today's podcast. I thought it looked pretty interesting to me. And when I talked to you, you said, yes, it's very interesting. Can you walk our listeners through what we learned yesterday?
Well, this is the content of some emails that has been acquired by 2 congressmen, James Comer and Jim Jordan, who are ranking members of 2 congressional committees. And they've persuaded the Department of Health and Human Services to let them see unredacted emails that were exchanged in February last year between senior health officials in the US and the UK and a group of expert virologists as to where this virus might have come from. Now, these emails are very important for the following reason. We knew about them already as of about August last year, when they were acquired. They were acquired under the Freedom of Information Act, and these emails describe 2 things. First, they describe an electrifying email that Dr. Fauci, head of NIAID, received on the late evening of January 31st of last year. And this email was from a group of virologists headed by Christian Anderson that had been commissioned to study the new virus, whose genome sequence had been published just 3 weeks previously. Mm-hmm. So these 4 virologists reported to Dr. Fauci that they had been studying the genome. They did not think the genome was natural. In other words, it was man-made. So what did Dr. Fauci do with this extraordinary piece of information? Well, the very next day, a teleconference was convened that included Dr. Fauci, probably Dr. Collins, though that's not completely clear, and an English health official called Jeremy Farrar, who is director of the Wellcome Trust in London. That's a large medical research agency that funds much virology research in Britain. So these three officials were on the line, along with many expert virologists, including the four who'd written the original email to Dr. Fauci.
That's a significant email, right? I mean,
right,
that's a very significant email.
What was important was that before the conference, the virologists had declared the virus was almost certainly man-made. And after the conference, within a few days, they were saying and preparing a scientific article that said the opposite, that there was no way it could have been man-made. It certainly emerged naturally. So this roused an enormous amount of interest into, well, what on earth had gone on at this conference that made these scientists change their mind? There didn't seem to be time for any new scientific evidence. Maybe some new scientific arguments were made. What on earth happened? But the enormous frustration was that when the emails had been delivered under the Freedom of Information Act, they were more or less blank. Almost the entire text had been redacted. So all you could see was the email headings, and nothing else. So what has happened? It's
comical. I'm just going to agree with you strongly. I've seen these emails. It's to and from and black. It's like how to scratch out black on your Instagram feed or something like that. Yes, what they released was comical. So sorry. So everyone wanted to know, well, what was in these emails? So right.
These two congressmen somehow or other persuaded the government to let them see the full text without redaction. So they weren't allowed to make copies. They weren't given an electronic copy. They had to go and look at these emails in camera. But fortunately, they had their staff manually.
Here's my email. You can read what I wrote there. That's basically what they were doing.
Right. I couldn't read that, Terry. But
exactly. That's my point. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they were copying all this stuff. So now we know at least some of what happened. So one extraordinary thing is that you'd expect for the scientists to have changed their mind. There must have been lots of scientific arguments pointing out why they were wrong. But to the contrary, almost all the scientific arguments presented during this conference were agreeing with the original Anderson letter. Other scientists chimed in saying, yeah, we just cannot understand how this virus could have arisen in nature. It really looks like it was man-made. And then you have statements from Collins saying, oh, well, it would be very bad for science and international relations if this line of inquiry became the dominant one. In other words,
can I quote him? From the email?
Yeah, sure.
He said, yeah. He said,
if you want me to find the exact quote,
I've got it right in front of me. He said,
okay.
we need to, say it was a natural origin, or the voices of conspiracy will quickly dominate, doing great potential harm to science and international harmony. In other words, we have to say it's natural, or will do harm to international harmony. Sorry. And I want to quote some of the other scientists too, if you don't mind, please.
Sure, please.
So in this interim period where these scientists are telling Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, the head of the NIH, that they think it's a lab leak, what they said was they have a hard time explaining that as an event outside the lab. It said there are possible ways in nature, but highly unlikely. One scientist said they were 70-30 or 60-40 lab leak. Another guy, I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you get from the bat virus to novel COVID, where you insert exactly 4 amino acids, 12 nucleotides that all have to be added at the exact same time to gain this function. And you don't change any other amino acids, and there's some science in there. So these are just some of the quotes I just wanted to read for the listeners during that discussion that scientists are having with the leaders of the American medical establishment. And then a few days after that, it's clearly natural origin.
Well, right. A decision is obviously made at this meeting, presumably by the health officials, contrary to the specific advice they were being given by almost all the virologists, that we are going to say this is natural emergence. And that's what happened. The scientists were then organized by Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Institute to compose an article that later appeared in a journal called Nature Medicine that said this must have emerged naturally. There's no way anyone could have concocted this virus in the laboratory, all of which was the direct opposite of what the scientists have been saying to each other and to Fauci and Collins in private. It was a tremendous piece of hypocrisy, but more important than that, we can now see that on purely political grounds, Fauci and Collins ignored the scientific advice they were given, and one has to ask why they did that.
What's the motive here? What's the motive?
And obviously the motive they give in the emails is ludicrous, harming science, or nothing could harm science more than a great big cover-up and rejection of scientific advice that we see here. I think what was happening, and then this is just a guess on my part, is that firstly, at this period in January 31st, February, in the early weeks of first week of February, Fauci and Collins were getting the advice from all the experts they consulted, this is man-made. That's one thing in their mind. The other thing in their mind was that they had funded the research and the lab from which the virus, if man-made, had probably escaped. So they would be on the hook if indeed the virus had escaped from one of their funded experiments. And they decided, very unfortunately, to go the natural emergence route and to suppress inquiry into the possibility of lab leak. And they were able to do this, I'm afraid, because Fauci and Collins, between them, and Farrar in London, these three men essentially control almost all academic virology research. So if you wanted to pursue a career in virology, you needed to listen very carefully to what these guys wanted you to do. And it was quite clear from Daszak's letter in the Lancet and from the article in Nature Medicine, from what anyone could see were authoritative figures, it was quite clear that the voice of authority was saying to virologists around the Western world, it is not acceptable to discuss the possibility that this is lab leak. Natural emergence is the answer here. And if you think anything else, don't expect to get a lot of funding on your next research proposal.
And if you're a theoretical scientist, if you work for a big pharma company, they have money. But unless you do that, the way you get funded is through the NIH.
Right. And big pharma has no sort of interest or business in looking into the origin of this virus. This is a job for academic research scientists, almost all of whom depended on funds from Collins, Fauci, and Farrar. And indeed, a few months later, several of the participants in this conference and the article, especially Christian Anderson and Bob Gary, participated in an $80 million grant that was given, distributed, I think, among 7 labs. So they all must have gotten a big chunk of it. And obviously you can't say a quid pro quo, but it doesn't look very good.
Right. There's independence in fact, and there's independence in appearance. And if you ask an accountant or a lawyer or the IRS, but they both matter. You need in fact, but you also need an appearance. At NASA, we had the same problem, Nicholas. If you're into space exploration, that money is coming from the government. Nowadays, Jeff Bezos has money and Elon Musk has money, but most money comes from NASA. And so people are just not willing to speak up against NASA. And I was in a meeting at the White House. Actually, I told Vice President Pence that the plans that NASA had for something called Gateway were not good. They needed to be modified. And there was 100 executives behind me. 100% of them came up to me and said, finally, somebody called the baby ugly. Thank you for saying that. We need to get this thought out there. And 100% of them said absolutely nothing in public about it because they're getting money from NASA. It's not NASA. It's not NIH. This is just lots of areas of life. You don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. Just right. in this case, that hand released a global pandemic, and you can't cover that up. That's the real fundamental problem here that I see.
I think that's right. I mean, it was covered up very successfully for many months, about a year and a half. But then, thanks to these Freedom of Information Act requests, the truth has slowly been coming out, and it's clear that we were funding very dangerous research,
right,
which should not have been being conducted. In a way, well, and there's plenty of blame to go around, but all these experiments were something that the world's virologists were very interested in doing. It's great fun to create new viruses, so you get papers in prestigious journals.
Right.
They all had a vested interest in following this very, very dangerous line of research that had high risk and almost no benefit.
Right. But if you're a virologist, that's the cutting edge. That's how that's how you get the Nobel Prize, or, that's how you get the admiration of your peers, is by doing something that never been done. And they were doing it. We talked about this before, at a BSL level 2, biosafety level 2, which is like going to the dentist's office. They were literally playing with the global pandemic, wearing a mask and putting a sign on the door that said, dangerous stuff's happening.
It was a very low safety level and totally inappropriate for the risk of the experiments they are undertaking.
This podcast is sponsored by Book Arts, the world's premier creators of unique books that are truly works of art. To see an example of one of their beautiful creations, a limited edition reproduction of the Apollo 11 flight plan, visit www.apolloflightplan.com. Now, the one issue about the emails that I've had, the Freedom of Information Act got us those completely redacted emails, and then the congressman pushed and pushed, and which is interesting. These are Republican congressmen now trying to uncover what happened with coronavirus, and it's the Democrats that are trying to uncover what happens on November 6th. I just wish that that was not a partisan. I wish truth wasn't a partisan thing. And then it was the NIH agreed to hold up the email to the Zoom camera and let people read it. And that just happened recently. And that's what this explosive story yesterday was. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And it gives a direct, I guess, verification that the top leaders were hearing from top scientists that there's a good chance this is man-made. And then the top leaders came out and said, there's no way it was man-made.
That's the story the emails are telling us. And unless Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins wish to give us some more information and tell us different, and that's what we have to assume happened, that they willfully ignored the clear advice they were being given by the majority of the experts they consulted.
You know who Dr. Ron Fauci is? He had an interesting quote here.
Right, he's a Dutch virologist at Erasmus University.
Who does, I don't know him, but when I looked, he does this type of research, gain of function research. In his quote, he said, further debate about such accusations would unnecessarily distract top researchers from their duties and do unnecessary harm to science in general and science in China in particular.
Well, that's so ridiculous. I mean, it's irrelevant. It's not a scientific argument. It's a political argument. This was meant to be a scientific discussion of the possible origin of the virus. So why is he introducing his irrelevant political views? And if that's his reason for doing nothing, then it's a very bad reason. What can one say? Right.
And I'm just going through these emails. Jeremy Farrar was the British scientist. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. He's the director of the Wellcome Trust. Now he's also on very friendly terms with senior Chinese health officials.
Right.
He tells us that in a book he wrote last year called Spike. And they were always calling him up to say, hey, Jeremy, heads up on a new epidemic we think we've got. And he was giving them information. How much information he gave them, I don't know, but it's clear that through Farah, the Chinese officials had a window into these sort of high-level scientific discussions in the West. Whether they influenced them, I don't know, but they certainly had an unhealthy degree of knowledge about them thanks to Farah. And of course, Farah ended up doing exactly what his Chinese friends wanted him to do, which was to arrange for all discussion of lab leak to be repressed. I think Dr. Farah has a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah. This email from him to Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, and Anthony Fauci, it says this one guy is 60-40 lab leak, and he said, I'm 50-50. 50-50 is not, this is a conspiracy theory that's ridiculous. 50-50 is like, it might happen,
Right. Well, I guess he's trying to hedge his bets or make himself look good. I mean, he's at this stage, he doesn't know which way the wind is going to go.
This is a big guy, though. This is not, I get 100 emails a day. Fauci probably gets 1,000. You can't say just because you emailed Anthony Fauci, he should know everything about it from 2 years ago. But this is the beginning of a pandemic. And this is top guys talking to top guys. In other words, there's no plausible scenario that our top officials didn't know that there was a lot of concern that this was a lab leak.
That's right. And if the system had worked properly, if any of them had done their clear public and scientific duty, they would have left no stone unturned in pursuit of the possibility their scientific experts were raising with them, i.e. that the virus had come from a lab. So it's quite unfathomable that they simply ignored this advice, paid no attention to what was happening. Fauci himself says in an email a few days later, well, this is not my area of expertise. I'm going to leave it all to Jeremy. Well, what kind of responsibility is that? But here's the guy, the head of the leading virology research institute in the United States, expressing no interest in where this virus may have come from, outsourcing it to a guy he knows is in cahoots with Chinese health officials. I mean, it's quite outrageous.
That he's funding that's in cahoots with Chinese health officials. In April, now this is a couple months, April 2020 was a bad month, but everything was going on. Francis Collins sends an email to Anthony Fauci that says, I'm wondering if there's something the NIH can do to help put down this very destructive conspiracy, which seems to be growing momentum, the lab leak hypothesis. So they're actively trying to, put this down. And Fauci's reply was, it's a shiny, don't do anything right now. It's a shiny object that'll go away with time. And he was right. It hasn't gone away, but it hasn't, there's not people in the streets demonstrating about this.
Well, it went away because Fauci and Collins and Peter Daszak were pulling out every stop to make it go away. It didn't just go away of its own accord. It went away because they placed articles in the scientific literature. These articles persuaded all the mainstream press that there was nothing to see here. This was just natural emergence. And the shiny object did indeed fade from view until it was forced back into view by the new facts we've been discussing.
Right. Beyond this, they had an amazing gift in Donald Trump, because Trump was throwing out, hey, maybe this came from the lab leak. And whatever Donald Trump said was immediately dismissed as conspiracy by lots of folks, because he said a lot of crazy things that were not true. And so he cried, the sky is falling, I think, way too many times. And the one time when he probably was right, a lot of people were willing to ignore it. I'll do an analogy. If you go back to 2016, when the emails got leaked from the Democrat, and they basically showed that the Democrats they were colluding against Bernie to try and get Hillary the nomination. That was obviously the big scandal of 2016. And the Russians hacked that. That was their doing. And that was a giant gift, because all the attention was on, the evil Russians are hacking us. Nobody really paid attention to the fact that the Democratic Party was colluding against its own candidate. And so in the same way, the lab leak conspiracy was just having Trump around was a gift to people that wanted to say, pay no attention to the man behind the mirror, because you could dismiss it as, oh, this is a crazy Trump conspiracy.
I think that's right. I mean, the propaganda campaign launched by Daszak, Farah, Fauci, and Collins, started in February and was well underway and had sort of convinced much of the press that there was nothing here. And all that happened before Trump's statement, which I think was in March of 2020. But Trump's statement had the effect you describe of sort of cementing the mainstream press's disdain for the possibility of lab.
Right. And that's really unfortunate. That's why you need leaders who are not constantly saying crazy things, because you have to be able to trust them. That's like a fundamental, we should know that. But in this case, that really hurt the case to bring the truth out, I think. And I want to say something about science in general, Nicholas. And I mean, this has been your life for the last, 40 plus years, writing about science. It's really important that we have government funded theoretical science. It's really important that we let scientists do science and that politicians don't tell them what to do. And we need to unpoliticize science. And it's really important that scientists collaborate. And that includes with Chinese and Europeans and whatever. All of those things need to happen in the scientific community to make human life better. If we didn't have science, we'd be living, on dirt farms in the 1600s. And so science is a good thing and we need to promote it. But my God, we need to be honest about a global plague that crushes human civilization.
I couldn't agree with you more. And this certainly is a horrible misstep. We shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater and sort of stop funding all science or all virology research. But we should try and understand what happened and then focus our remedies on what went wrong, starting with the fact that virologists as a community, I think, have been very irresponsible. And here they stand in contrast to many other types of scientists who have seen impending dangers, particularly in sort of genetic engineering, have taken measures to alert the public to these possible dangers, have put safety measures in place which were gradually reduced when they had assessed the risk and found it wasn't as bad as feared. Virologists have not taken this route. They have tried to do this very dangerous research, more or less behind closed doors, without proper examination by non-virologists, and professions that don't regulate themselves deserve to get regulated by others.
Right.
This is
peer review.
I think virologists have now chosen for themselves.
Peer review is a very scientific concept. And so maybe, the research safety, the BSLs need to be peer reviewed or something. I don't know. I'm not a virologist. I don't want to pretend to be one, but it comes back to this idea of moral hazard, right? If somebody else takes a risk and they get all the benefit, but if they fail, you get all the pain, that's a moral hazard. The global financial crisis, these Wall Street guys were making millions rolling the dice. And then when they failed, we had to bail them out, is a good example. Well, in this case, they get to do their fun research and get government money. And then when they fail, we all get sick and die from COVID. That needs to be part of the equation too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we do have, as you said, these graduated safety levels, which actually come to us thanks to the biologists who pointed out the possible dangers of genetic engineering. So the virologists had this system of labs going from highest safety to lowest. But the trouble is, working in the highest safety lab is very inconvenient. You have to put on a sort of a space suit and all the air has to be filtered. Every operation takes twice as long. They don't like doing it.
Right.
So they meaning the international community of virologists, set standards for working with these viruses that were far too low. You were allowed to work with these coronaviruses in BSL-2, which was what was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It was only if you were actually working with SARS-1 or MERS, the two predecessor epidemic-causing viruses, you had to go up as far as BSL-3. No work had to be done in BSL-4.
Right. So that's something that needs to be looked at. Yeah.
That was a clear example of the virologists acting according to their own convenience and not to public safety.
we're clearly hammering the NIH and Collins and Fauci, and those are facts. I'm not making these. This is not my opinion. I'm reading from emails that got released. We're hammering the scientists for maybe not doing the BSL, but at the end of the day, this happened in China. The Chinese had a very authoritarian communist response in that they lied about it. They arrested and punished people who tried to speak up about it. They didn't tell the world what was going on until it was too late. And then they cleaned everything up and washed it. And they are so harsh against their citizens in so many ways that there's nobody that's going to speak up. We already saw this movie, right, back in 1979. We didn't review that, but can you give us a brief refresher of the first version before we just saw the remake?
Sorry, the first version
of the Soviet lab leak.
Oh, right. Well, that was an outbreak of anthrax in a city called Sverdlovsk, and the Soviets at first said, "Well, this is a matter of tainted meat. This is a natural occurrence." And they persuaded many scientists in the West that this is what had happened. There were the usual cries of, let's not be harsh on the Soviets, let's be understanding toward them. And the Soviet explanation was generally accepted for about a decade, until the Soviet Union fell apart. And Yeltsin told us that, by the way, it was a military accident. There was a production facility for making anthrax, which, by the way, was in violation of the Biological Warfare Convention. You're not allowed to produce military quantities of biological agents. The leak had been carried downwind into the city of Sverdlovsk. So that was the parallels to the present case of very obvious, an authoritarian government suffering an accident, putting out a cover story that it was a natural occurrence, and taking many years before the truth came out.
So what will this congressional committee do? Like, what I'm thinking of what concrete actions are to come next. We talked about maybe having some type of peer-reviewed virology safety procedures. That would be good, but China's not going to admit this. As long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power, they're not going to admit it. And so what good can come besides, everybody can be outraged and mad, but that doesn't help anything. What can happen?
Well, first, I think there is a chance that the Chinese Communist Party might come around to admitting it if one can get enough evidence showing that the virus did indeed come out of their lab. And you can see the outlines of a sort of diplomatic solution, which would go along the lines of, there's plenty of blame to go all around here. Sure, this accident happened on Chinese soil, but it was being funded by the US government. So, both governments could be held to share the blame. And on that basis, the Chinese could sort of fess up and say, well, yeah, it did come from our lab. We're very sorry. Here's how it happened. But that optimistic scenario, I think, will only take place if the Chinese are forced to admit what happened. And this will only happen if we get enough evidence, which may already be present in the US and being held by Dr. Dashak at the EcoHealth Alliance and by the NIH. Now, both these entities—
Wow, what might that be? Yeah.
Well, because Dr. Dashak was funding Dr. Xi Zhengli, he knew exactly what she was doing. He had regular reports on what she was up to, what she was thinking, what she had planned. He must have voluminous information that he has not yet given up. And he and the NIH are at present enjoying a very peculiar degree of protection, which I cannot really explain. But it's protection which has so far prevented them from having to give up any serious information, except the very little dribs and drabs we're getting through Freedom of Information Act requests. Now, I think that may change if there's a change in Congress and if the Republicans are able to issue subpoenas for evidence, which at present they cannot without democratic agreement, which is being withheld. So that's
so the Democrats are trying to not press this case.
Right, because as you mentioned, this issue has become polarized, which is totally ridiculous. It's a scientific—
It's ridiculous. This is not a Republican Democrat. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat myself, and this issue is not either.
Right.
January 6th is clearly, but this is not.
It shouldn't be polarized, but alas, it is. And so
Yeah.
the Democrats are protecting Fauci and Dashak from having to tell us all they know about this appalling epidemic, which I think is a terribly irresponsible thing for Democrats to do. They should be as interested as anyone else in getting to the bottom of this.
They're the party of science.
Right. I'm afraid both sides abuse science.
But I could envision the subpoena is the key, because then you have to turn over data if it exists. I mean, it's hard to delete emails, but he's a PhD. He could probably figure out how to do that. I could envision a state attorney general bringing some type of class action suit, like the New York attorney general is always suing whatever. I wonder if that could be a case of they sue this company in Rhode Island for I don't know if that's an avenue or not, a state attorney general versus a congressional committee.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the answer is more likely to come from Congress. And if the midterm elections put the Republicans in control of the House or even both houses, then I think we will see subpoenas and we will see a lot of information come out.
Well, Jim Jordan has said in the past that, nobody should try and hold information from a congressional committee, and they'll, until the January 6th committee came around. But hopefully this will come into the light of day. This is an issue that definitely needs some sunshine, I think.
I think so too.
Are there any other big things that broke, or was this, have we hit all the revelations from January 11th, the emails?
I think we've hit the highlight with this new batch of emails.
Right. Well, Nicholas, thank you for coming on. This is an unusual topic, but I think it's so important. I just don't want it to die on the vine. And hopefully some folks can share it and, generate enough noise. If the public wants something done, and then that translates into votes, and that's when Congress acts. So hopefully that can happen.
Let's hope.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Terry, for your interest.